After seeing the case study that we are going to show today, you might not believe it. What happened in the plane flying at an altitude of 34,000 feet? That suddenly all the passengers and pilots turned dead without any sound or movement. Why fighter planes were ordered to shoot down this passenger plane? Was the plane hijacked by some unknown force, or was it a terrorist plot? It seems to be the story of a thriller film, but believe us, this is a true incident that shocked the whole world. – 2005 Larnaca International Airport in Cyprus. Helios Airways Flight JU522 takes off from London and lands at Larnaca Airport at around 1:25 am. After the flight arrives at the terminal, the flight crew member complains to the airport ground staff about a strange sound coming from the plane's service door and asks the ground staff to thoroughly inspect the entire plane. After this, the ground staff engineer manually pressurizes the plane and checks for any leakage in it, and denies any fault in the plane in his report. Registered as Olympia, almost 7-year-old, this Boeing 737 plane was inducted into Helios Airways on April 2004. After all these checks are completed, the plane starts preparing for its next flight. For its next flight, the plane was to go from Larnaca Airport to Athens International Airport in Greece, for which new crew members and pilots were appointed. For this flight, among with 115 passengers, there were 6 crew members on board this plane that day. 58-year-old German pilot Hans-Jürgen Merten. Hans-Jürgen Merten was the captain of this flight, who had also been working with Helios Airways for the last 35 years. Captain Hans-Jürgen Merten had a total of 16,900 hours of flying experience, of which 5,500 hours were on similar Boeing 737 aircraft. 51-year-old Captain Pampos Charalampos, who was working with Helios Airways for last 5 years, was appointed as the first officer. First Officer Pampos Charalampos also had 7,549 hours of flying experience. At around 8 am, after slowly boarding all the passengers, the Helios flight begins its roll-off process and reaches the runway. After completing all the pre-flight checks, the Helios flight takes off from Larnaca International Airport at around 9:07 am. The weather was absolutely clear and everything was going on as usual. Following its flight route, the plane flies over the Mediterranean Sea and moves towards its designated height. The Helios flight had to cover this distance from Larnaca to Athens International Airport in about 1 hour 23 minutes. Gradually increasing its height, the plane was moving towards its destination. About 10 minutes after takeoff, when the plane reaches an altitude of 12,000 feet, then suddenly, the cabin pressure warning alarm starts ringing in the cockpit. As usually, the meaning of this alarm is to tell the pilot that there is some fault in the cabin pressure system of the plane, and therefore, the pilot should not increase the height of the plane. But unfortunately, the pilots could not understand this warning alarm properly, and they thought it was a flight takeoff configuration warning alarm, which should have sounded before the takeoff of the flight and not 10 minutes after the takeoff. The takeoff configuration warning alarm is usually sounded before takeoff to inform pilots that the plane is not configured properly for takeoff, and they should abort the takeoff and complete all flight checks again. But here, the plane had already reached a height of 12,000 feet after takeoff. So why is this alarm ringing now? Thinking of this, the confusion of the pilots was increasing, and the plane was still climbing upwards. And in the next few minutes, multiple warning alarms started ringing in the cockpit one by one. Already upset due to the cabin pressure warning alarm, both the pilots start trying to fix these new warning alarms. After a lot of effort, when both the pilots are unable to fix these warning alarms, they finally call the Helios maintenance ground team for help. By now, the plane had reached a height of 18,000 feet. The pilots were just trying to explain their problem to the maintenance team when suddenly the passenger oxygen alarm starts ringing and oxygen masks start hanging in the passenger cabin. But the pilots in the cockpit were still not aware that the oxygen masks were hanging in the passenger cabin. Pilots were still asking Helios maintenance team of how to resolve the takeoff configuration warning alarm. After some time, the service team connect the calls of the pilots to the ground engineer of the plane. When ground engineer asked the pilots for information about the fault in the plane, the pilots say that they feel that the ventilation cooling system is not working. Hearing this, the engineer asked the pilot to check the pressurization button of the plane and ask whether this button is set to auto mode or not. But troubled by the different warning messages being played in the cockpit, the pilots ignored the service engineer question and asked him for details on repairing the ventilation cooling system. And then suddenly the conversation between the pilots and the service engineer stops. Ground service team and ATC repeatedly try to contact the pilots, but there is no response from the pilots. According to its fixed route plan, the plane was still increasing its height, and after reaching a height of 34,000 feet, the plane was still moving towards its destination. At around 9:30 am, ATC again tries to contact the pilots, but they didn't get any response. At 9:37 am, the plane leaves the airspace of Cyprus and enters the airspace of Athens. Usually, when the plane moves from one airspace to another, the pilots inform the corresponding ATC towers of the new airspace. But the pilots of this plane did not make any kind of contact with the ATC tower. Without making any contact, following its assigned route, the plane was still flying at an altitude of 34,000 feet. Between 10:12 am and 10:50 am, 19 attempts were made by ATC to contact the Helios flight. But unfortunately, there was no response from the pilots any time. At 10:40 am, flying at an altitude of 35,000 feet, the Helios flight starts circling the holding pattern set by the Athens airport. Despite repeated attempts, when there was no contact with the pilots of the plane, then two F-16 fighter jets from the nearby Hellenic Air Force Station are sent to check the Helios flight. At about 11:24 am, both the fighter planes reach near the Helios flight, after which one fighter plane starts flying behind the Helios flight, while the other fighter plane tries to look into the plane by flying side of it. On peeping into the plane, the fighter pilot sees that the first officer is lying motionless on his seat, while the captain's seat is vacant. The fighter pilot then tries to get a little closer and look through the passenger cabin window. He sees that all the passengers are on their seats, but there is no movement in any of the passengers. Oxygen masks are also hanging in the passenger cabin, but none of the passengers were wearing oxygen masks. Suddenly, The fighter pilot sees an unknown man without an oxygen mask coming into the cockpit of the Helios plane, who sits down on the captain's seat. Seeing this, the fighter pilot goes a little closer to the Helios plane and tries to attract the attention of that person. But in a state of unconsciousness, that stranger does not pay any attention to the fighter plane. At about 11:50 am, smoke starts coming out of the left engine, and after some time, with the shutdown of left engine, the plane starts tilting to one side. At around 11:54 am, two mayday messages are recorded in the cockpit voice recorder of the flight. And at about 12 o'clock, when the plane was flying at an altitude of 7,100 feet, then the right engines also shut down due to exhaustion of fuel. As soon as the both engines stop, the plane starts descending rapidly. At around 12:04 pm, 40 kilometers from Athens airport, the plane crashed in the hills near Grammatico. Unfortunately, all the people aboard the plane die in this tragic accident. It was the biggest and most painful air crash in the history of Greece, and immediately an investigation was started. During the investigation, the investigator found that on the night before this ill-fated flight, when the plane reached Larnaca International Airport from London, the crew members of the flight noticed a strange sound from the service door on the right side of the plane. They had complained about this issue to the ground service staff and asked them to thoroughly check the plane. In view of this complaint, the ground engineer checks for any possible leaks by manually pressurizing the plane. To test this, the engineer sets the plane's pressurization button from auto mode to manual mode, and with the help of the plane's APU power, creates air pressure in the plane so that any kind of leakage can be detected. After completion of the pressurization test, the pressurization button of the plane has to be removed from manual mode and set back in auto mode. But unfortunately, the engineer forgets to set the pressurization button in auto mode. Generally, due to this auto mode, when the plane goes to high altitude and the air pressure in the cabin decreases, this button automatically maintains the air pressure in the cabin of the plane, so that all the passengers and crew members in the plane can breathe easily. And if for some reason this button is set to manual mode, then it is the responsibility of the pilots to maintain the air pressure in the plane manually. According to standard procedure before any flight, pilots checks and confirm the auto mode of this button during 3 different checking phases: pre-flight checks, after start check, and after takeoff check. But unfortunately, the pilots of the Helios flight also did not check the pressurization button during these 3 phases, and this button remained in manual mode. So after takeoff, as the Helios flight reaches high altitude, the air pressure in the plane's cabin went down. As soon as the air pressure in the plane decreased, the computer of the plane started giving cabin pressure warning message in the cockpit. But unfortunately, the pilots could not understand this warning message, and they thought it was a warning message of takeoff configuration error. The cabin pressure warning message and the takeoff configuration warning message sound the same, and that's probably why the pilots got confused. And now as the plane was going up, the air pressure in the plane started decreasing. And when the air pressure in the plane crossed the danger mark, the oxygen masks in the passenger cabin started hanging automatically, due to which the master warning alarm started ringing in the cockpit as well. And the oxygen masks did not automatically hang in the cockpit, so the pilots could not even know that the air pressure in the plane had reduced, and the oxygen masks were hanging in the passenger cabin. And generally due to lack of oxygen in the plane, along with the passengers and cabin crew, the pilots were also going unconscious. In such a condition, the oxygen gradually decreases, the body does not even know when the brain becomes numb, and the person becomes senseless and finally dies. For this reason, when the ground engineer asked the pilot on the radio to check the pressurization button, the pilots did not understand it due to state of unconsciousness, and slowly the first officer faints on his seat. At that time, the captain was trying to check the electric circuit at the rear of the cockpit, so he fainted there. For this reason, F-16 fighter pilots did not see the captain at his seat. After examining the cockpit voice recorder, the investigator found that the stranger who was seen by the fighter pilots entering the cockpit was flight attendant Andreas P., who was briefly conscious with the help of a portable oxygen cylinder and somehow trying to control the plane. If we talk about the Boeing 737 plane, whenever the oxygen pressure in the plane is low, oxygen is supplied to the passenger cabin and cockpit. This oxygen supply is enough for about 12 minutes so that the pilot can easily bring the plane down to 10,000 feet. At that altitude, passenger and cabin crew can breathe easily without any oxygen mask. But unfortunately, the pilot of the Helios flight could not detect the reduced air pressure in the plane, and along with the passengers, cabin crew and pilots died silently in the air. As plane was flying on autopilot mode, so until the fuel in the plane was over, it kept flying on its own and finally crashed after running out of fuel. Helios Airways stopped all its flight on 31st October 2006, almost a year after this accident. In March 2011, US Federal Aviation ordered the installation of 2 additional warning lights on all Boeing 737 aircraft so that pilots can accurately detect cabin pressurization and takeoff configuration warnings. These important changes in the aviation world made air travel more safer. But unfortunately, the passengers and cabin crew of Helios Airlines Flight 522 had to pay the price of these changes with their lives. Through our entire team and viewers, we pray for the peace of the souls of all the people who lost their lives in this tragic accident. If you liked our video, please encourage us by clicking on like and subscribe button. We are really grateful to you for your kind cooperation. Thanks a lot.